Anything else come to mind when you think about this space? Any other tips, tricks, things that you would want leaders in game dev to know?
So there's one more that's a little experimental, but like I liked it. It worked for me pretty well. I have a thing I like calling prototype series that maybe somebody else invented and I just accidentally reinvented and sort of named it the same thing. But um, as a leader and as especially as a producer, I think there is a desire to get in and try to do tracking and planning on individual bits of exploration, be it concept or technology or especially design. And while that can have some value, I feel like when uncertainty is high, you're better off structuring the work as basically um, a targeted batch that you have X number of prototypes string together that are all revolving around a similar question or a similar line of investigation. That has a couple of advantages. One is if you build a prototype series, it's a lot easier for engineers to support that because they can kind of get a sense of the chunk of exploration and kind of what are the technology needs and sort of how to feed it. The other advantage is you don't have to sort of really deal as much of the whiplash of sort of prototypes, individual prototypes within that series being spun up and spun down. And you can, like you don't want to have to sort of recalibrate the team every time a prototype runs into a wall and you have to sort of, rethink it. It's good to sort of have a bigger box of prototype series that sort of gives you a little bit more room to play. The other advantage is I think it puts you in a better mindset to be disciplined as to sort of what do we expect, what are the major questions in play, what are the constraints, what's the time box for the prototype series, as opposed to an individual prototype where suddenly you're spending too much time looking at trees instead of sort of the forest, as to sort of like, hey, a prototype series should take a couple of weeks and it's roughly a topic and we should be able to sort of post-mortem it and sort of debrief sort of learnings from it. And as a producer, it's a lot easier to hold the team's feet to the fire in a healthy way, making sure that we're using a prototype series efficiently and that when we wind it down, we sort of expect it to have meaningful answers. I think it's a better tool. And not all prototype series will bear fruit, but like I do feel like if they're structured well, it's much more likely that you can feel confident that you're advancing the project month over month or quarter over quarter with that tool than sort of like a random grab bag of prototypes that are running in all directions and that you yourself are losing the thread as to sort of what questions are really in play. Having too many variables moving at the same time when you're trying to answer questions is bad science.
Yeah, yeah,
Intentionally freezing some variables and selecting some variables to sort of really dig in on while you leave the less frozen might feel a little strange for the team because they're like, well, what if I just want to touch that variable? You're like, well, let's just be disciplined as a team, run a prototype series with these variables. And if for some reason you really need to hit the brakes and put up a hand and say, well, I actually really, really want to touch that thing outside the constraints of the prototype series, it's a conversation. We don't have to be, crazy. It's like, it's like a sprint.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
no rule that says like, oh no, we can't question it at any point in time. I think in general, the size of the batches of work is a really difficult to wrap your head around for a lot of leaders because they're used to one altitude, and that altitude is either I trust my team, I let them do whatever they want, or we're looking at sort of multi-day batches of work or single tasks, and that's where people feel
Yeah.
comfortable being leaders from. And when you're dealing with sort of exploration structures, I feel like looking at sort of weeks of work or it varies per genre. You're better off. Like I know there's a lot of people that love 2 weeks because it's like magic for a lot of reasons. And I'm like, you should sort of open yourself up to like varying that number based off the nature of the work. And don't be surprised that like, unleashing a concept artist for a 4-week batch is more efficient than trying to split that into two because they're like, really, it's the same flavor of exploration. And it might be 3 weeks, it might be one. I think it's only later in the project that it's sort of like finding your work batches sort of start getting a little bit more stable and standardized, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Canonize that when that happens, but
It's
yeah,
I think it yeah, it's a thing that too that I would say that the when scale starts to happen, you there are I'm always torn on this because I like highly flexible iteration lengths. So like if your team wants to run twice a day and your team wants to run every 2 weeks, I'm like that's fine. But I also get that at scale, some amount of like, hey, we there's a rhythm that we can establish to development, and that rhythm is helpful for us in predictability. I wish people picked a week instead of 2 weeks, generally speaking, but fair enough. I lost that one before I even got into it. So, yeah, I broadly what you're describing, I'm
Yeah.
a huge fan of. Like that's how you said it too, is understand the uncertainty of the system and build your iteration length around that. Be comfortable with where that is or
Yeah, I
isn't.
think there's a very good fundamental reason for that, which is the thing I said earlier, which is often explorations need to be evaluated as a set, not as individuals. You're giving
Hmm.
notes on individual explorations. You're talking about it, but as far as decisively coming to sort of like committed to conclusions, it's more of a set question, and you're not going to develop often a meaningful set that's worthy of real serious evaluation if the batches are too short. You end up sort of
Yeah.
you
Yep.
end up analyzing the trees, and you never have the forest conversation because your batches weren't big enough. So,
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's where too you have different types of iterations. There's like a local work iteration, like something like a sprint, and then you might have like I'd almost say that something that you're describing in the prototype series is, hey, maybe a series takes 6 weeks, and we're going to do a whole ton of prototypes in a 6 week window, depending on number of people and what you're trying to get done, and then we're going to evaluate those prototypes and see, and then we're going to switch the variables we're playing with, and we're going to like set some different conditions for this one, like hey, run another 6 weeks.